The rain pounded against the windows of Murphy's Tavern like angry fists demanding entry. Inside, the warm yellow light created a bubble of comfort against the cold October night. Thomas McKinnon sat hunched over his third whiskey, his calloused hands wrapped around the glass like it was his last lifeline. The construction worker had been coming to this same bar for 15 years, ever since his wife Sarah passed away from cancer. Tonight felt different, though. The letter in his jacket pocket crinkled every time he moved, reminding him of its presence. The bank's final notice. 3 months behind on mortgage payments, and they were taking his house next week. The same house where he'd carried Sarah over the threshold as newlyweds, where they'd planned to raise children, where he'd held her hand as she took her last breath. Thomas ordered another drink, ignoring the concerned look from Mickey, the bartender who'd known him since he was a young man full of hope. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it dulled the sharp edges of his pain. Around him, other patrons laughed and talked, their voices creating a buzz that felt miles away from his private suffering. As the night grew later, the alcohol made everything seem both clearer and more confused. Thomas found himself thinking about his father, a proud man who'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table during the Great Depression. What would his father think of him now? A broken-down drunk about to lose everything because he couldn't pull himself together after Sarah's death. The decision formed slowly in his mind, like fog lifting from a lake. He needed money, and he needed it fast. The jewelry store down on 5th Street always had expensive watches and rings in the window. The old security guard there was friendly, always nodded hello when Thomas walked past on his way to work sites. It would be easy, Thomas told himself. Just a quick grab and run. Nobody would get hurt. At closing time, Mickey gently suggested Thomas call a cab, but Thomas waved him off. The cool night air hit his face as he stumbled out into the street, his feet carrying him toward 5th Street without conscious thought. The streetlights created pools of yellow light that seemed to dance and sway as he walked. His heart pounded, but whether from fear, alcohol, or desperation, he couldn't tell. The jewelry store sat dark and quiet, its security lights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Thomas pressed his face against the glass, peering inside at the glittering displays. Thousands of dollars worth of merchandise just sitting there behind thin glass. It seemed unfair somehow. All that wealth locked away while people like him struggled just to keep a roof over their heads. He picked up an empty beer bottle from the gutter, feeling its weight in his hand. The plan was simple. Break the window, grab whatever he could, and run. He'd sell everything to a pawn shop across town, pay the bank, and start over. Maybe move to another city where nobody knew about his failures. Thomas raised the bottle, his arm trembling slightly. This wasn't who he was supposed to be. Sarah had always seen the good in him, believed he could overcome any obstacle. But Sarah wasn't here anymore, and the world had become a cold, unforgiving place where good men got crushed by circumstances beyond their control. The sound of footsteps made him freeze. Around the corner came Harold Fitzgerald, the night security guard making his rounds. Harold was 72 years old, a retired police officer who took the job to supplement his small pension. He walked with a slight limp from an old knee injury, but his eyes were still sharp and alert. Harold spotted Thomas immediately and approached with concern rather than suspicion. The old guard had seen enough drunks in his 40 years of law enforcement to recognize someone who was hurting rather than dangerous. Thomas tried to hide the bottle behind his back, but his coordination was too poor for stealth. The 2 men stood facing each other under the streetlight, an old guard who'd dedicated his life to protecting others and a desperate man who'd never imagined he'd consider breaking the law. Harold's uniform was neat and pressed, his badge polished to a shine. Even at his age, he carried himself with dignity and purpose. Thomas felt shame wash over him as he looked into Harold's kind eyes. This wasn't some faceless corporation he was planning to rob. This was a working man's livelihood, protected by another working man just trying to make an honest living. The weight of what he'd almost done crashed down on him like a physical blow. But the alcohol and desperation were still there, clouding his judgment. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. Harold said something about helping him get home safely, his voice gentle and understanding. Thomas wanted to accept the kindness, to walk away and find another solution to his problems. Instead, in a moment of poor judgment that would change everything, Thomas swung the bottle upward toward Harold's head. The old guard saw it coming and ducked, but not quite fast enough. The bottle struck his security helmet with a sharp crack, shattering into pieces that scattered across the sidewalk like fallen stars. Harold staggered backward, more surprised than hurt. His helmet had absorbed most of the impact, leaving him with nothing more than a slight headache. Thomas stood there swaying, pieces of broken glass at his feet, realizing with crystal clarity what he'd just done. He'd assaulted a good man who'd only wanted to help him. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the whisper of wind through empty streets. Both men knew that everything had changed in that single moment of violence. Harold reached for his radio, his training taking over despite his shock. Thomas prepared to run, knowing that his life as he'd known it was over. But then something unexpected happened, something that would make both men question everything they thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the power of human compassion. Harold's hand stopped just short of his radio, and he looked at Thomas with an expression that held no anger, only profound sadness and understanding. Harold Fitzgerald's hand trembled as it hovered over his radio. 40 years of police work had taught him that protocol demanded he call for backup immediately. A drunk man had just assaulted him with a weapon, even if that weapon was only a broken bottle and the assault had failed to cause serious injury. The law was clear, and Harold had spent his entire career following the law. But something in Thomas's eyes stopped him. It wasn't defiance or anger that Harold saw there. It was pure, devastating shame. The kind of shame that comes when a fundamentally good person realizes they've crossed a line they never thought they would cross. Harold had seen that look before, usually on the faces of first-time offenders who'd made terrible decisions in moments of desperation. Thomas stood frozen, expecting the familiar sound of sirens and the cold metal of handcuffs. His mind raced through the consequences. Arrest, jail time, a criminal record that would make finding work impossible, the final destruction of any chance to save his house or rebuild his life. He thought of Sarah and how disappointed she would be if she could see him now. Instead of reaching for his radio, Harold slowly removed his helmet and examined the crack running across its surface. The impact had been significant enough to damage the hard plastic, but the helmet had done its job. Without it, the blow might have caused serious injury or worse. Harold set the helmet down on the hood of a nearby parked car and studied the man before him. Thomas was clearly not a career criminal. His clothes, though worn, were clean and well-maintained. His hands bore the calluses of honest work, and despite the alcohol on his breath, he carried himself like someone unaccustomed to breaking the law. Harold's experienced eye could usually spot hardened criminals within seconds, and Thomas didn't fit the profile. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Thomas finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. He began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush of confession and apology. He told Harold about Sarah's death, about the medical bills that had drained their savings, about the house he was about to lose, about the crushing loneliness that followed him everywhere. Harold listened without interrupting, his weathered face reflecting a lifetime of hearing similar stories. He'd seen what grief and desperation could do to good people, how quickly circumstances could turn law-abiding citizens into lawbreakers. During his police career, he'd arrested single mothers shoplifting food for their children, elderly people stealing medicine they couldn't afford, and countless others who'd committed crimes born of necessity rather than malice. As Thomas spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. He explained how he'd never intended to hurt anyone, how the plan had seemed so simple in his alcohol-clouded mind. Just grab some jewelry, sell it, pay the bank, and start over. He'd convinced himself that insurance would cover any losses, that no real person would be harmed. The reality of what he'd almost done, and what he'd actually done to Harold, hit him like a physical blow. Harold found himself thinking about his own life, his own struggles. His police pension barely covered his basic needs, which was why he'd taken this security job in the first place. His wife Mary had been battling arthritis for years, and their medical expenses continued to mount. He understood financial pressure, understood the fear of losing everything you'd worked for. But Harold also thought about his grandson Jimmy, a bright 12-year-old who looked up to his grandfather as a hero. Jimmy often talked about becoming a police officer like Grandpa Harold, about protecting people and upholding justice. What would Jimmy think if he knew his grandfather had let a criminal walk away? What message would that send about right and wrong? The internal struggle played out across Harold's face as he weighed his options. Duty versus mercy, Law versus compassion, justice versus understanding. These weren't abstract concepts to Harold. They were the fundamental tensions he'd navigated throughout his career. He'd seen how rigid application of the law could sometimes cause more harm than good. But he'd also seen how failing to enforce consequences could enable further criminal behavior. Thomas noticed Harold's hesitation and fell to his knees on the cold sidewalk, glass crunching beneath him. He begged for forgiveness, not just for his actions, but for the man he'd become. He spoke of Sarah's belief in redemption, her faith that people could change and grow from their mistakes. He promised that if Harold gave him another chance, he would find a way to make things right without resorting to crime. Harold looked down at the broken man before him and saw something that reminded him of his own darkest moments. There had been times during his police career when the weight of human suffering had nearly broken him, when the constant exposure to humanity's worst impulses had made him question his faith in people's fundamental goodness. Mary had been his anchor during those times, reminding him that mercy and compassion were strengths, not weaknesses. The old guard made a decision that would haunt him for weeks to come. Instead of calling for backup, Harold helped Thomas to his feet. He looked the younger man directly in the eyes and spoke words that neither of them would ever forget. Harold told Thomas that everyone deserved a second chance, but that such chances came with responsibility and expectations. Harold's voice was steady but firm as he explained his conditions. Thomas would not be arrested tonight, but this was not forgiveness in the traditional sense. It was an opportunity for redemption that came with strings attached. Harold had a different kind of justice in mind, one that might actually help Thomas rebuild his life, rather than simply punish him for his mistakes. The proposal Harold made was unusual, born from decades of experience with both criminals and victims. Instead of facing arrest and jail time, Thomas would have the chance to prove that tonight's actions were an aberration rather than a glimpse of his true character. But the path to redemption would not be easy, and failure would carry consequences far worse than a simple assault charge. As Harold outlined his plan, Thomas felt a mixture of hope and terror. The old guard was offering him something precious, a chance to remain the man Sarah had believed him to be. But the price of that chance would test every bit of strength and integrity Thomas had left. Harold's proposal was unlike anything Thomas could have imagined. Instead of calling the police, the old security guard made an offer that would change both their lives forever. Harold explained that he'd seen too many good people destroyed by the criminal justice system, turned into hardened criminals by a single mistake made in a moment of desperation. The terms were simple but demanding. Thomas would work for Harold every weekend for the next 6 months, helping him with various tasks around the neighborhood. The work would be unpaid, serving as both restitution for the assault and a way for Thomas to prove his character. If Thomas completed the 6 months without missing a single weekend, Harold would consider the debt paid and would never report the incident. But if Thomas failed to show up even once, or if he got arrested for any other crime during that period, Harold would immediately report the assault along with detailed documentation of Thomas's confession. The old guard's police training had taught him the importance of evidence, and he would be prepared to ensure Thomas faced the full consequences of his actions. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he listened to Harold's conditions. 6 months of weekend work seemed like a small price to pay for avoiding jail time and a criminal record, but something in Harold's eyes suggested this arrangement would be more challenging than simple manual labor. The old guard had a deeper plan in mind, one that would test Thomas's commitment to change. Harold led Thomas to a nearby coffee shop that stayed open all night, a warm refuge from the cold October streets. Over steaming cups of coffee, Harold began to explain his philosophy about crime and punishment. He'd spent 4 decades watching the criminal justice system fail both victims and perpetrators, creating cycles of violence and desperation that seemed impossible to break. The old guard had arrested thousands of people during his career, but he'd never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. He'd seen hardened criminals transform their lives through acts of service and compassion, and he'd seen minor offenders become career criminals after being processed through an uncaring system. Harold believed that true justice required more than punishment. It required healing and growth. Thomas listened with growing understanding as Harold described his vision. The weekend work wouldn't just be random tasks designed to keep Thomas busy. Instead, Harold had identified specific problems in their community that needed attention, issues that city services couldn't or wouldn't address. Thomas would help Harold tackle these problems one weekend at a time. The first project Harold outlined involved Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow who lived 3 blocks away. Her late husband had been a skilled gardener, but since his death 2 years ago, her yard had become overgrown and unwieldy. Mrs. Chen was too proud to ask for help and too frail to maintain the property herself. City ordinances required homeowners to keep their yards neat, and Mrs. Chen had received several citations that carried hefty fines she couldn't afford. Harold explained that he'd been wanting to help Mrs. Chen for months but couldn't handle the physical demands of yard work with his bad knee. Thomas's construction experience and younger body would make the job possible. Together, they would restore Mrs. Chen's garden to its former beauty, while respecting her dignity and independence. The second project involved the Martinez family, whose teenage son had been paralyzed in a car accident 6 months earlier. The family's small house had no wheelchair accessibility, forcing the young man to remain confined to a single room on the ground floor. The parents worked multiple jobs to pay medical bills and couldn't afford the modifications their son needed. Harold had researched the requirements and believed that Thomas's construction skills could make the necessary changes for the cost of materials alone. As Harold described more projects, Thomas began to understand the scope of what the old guard was proposing. This wasn't just about restitution for a single moment of poor judgment. Harold was offering Thomas a chance to rebuild his sense of purpose and self-worth through service to others who were struggling with their own challenges. Thomas thought about Sarah and how much she would have loved Harold's approach. She'd always believed that helping others was the best way to heal personal pain, that focusing on someone else's needs could provide perspective on your own problems. During her illness, Sarah had insisted on continuing her volunteer work at a local food bank, even when chemotherapy left her exhausted and weak. The conversation continued through the night, with Harold sharing stories from his police career, and Thomas opening up about his marriage and his struggles since Sarah's death. The old guard had a gift for listening, asking thoughtful questions that helped Thomas articulate feelings he'd been carrying alone for too long. As dawn approached, Harold made one final point that would prove crucial to Thomas's transformation. The old guard explained that while the weekend work was mandatory, Thomas's attitude and effort would determine whether the arrangement succeeded. Harold could force Thomas to show up, but he couldn't force him to care about the people they would be helping. True redemption, Harold argued, required genuine compassion and a willingness to put others' needs ahead of your own comfort. If Thomas approached the work as merely a punishment to be endured, both men would fail. But if Thomas could find meaning and purpose in helping his neighbors, the experience might save his life in ways that went far beyond avoiding criminal charges. Thomas left the coffee shop as the sun rose over the city, his mind clearer than it had been in months. The alcohol had worn off, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. He had 5 days to prepare for his first weekend of service, 5 days to decide whether he would embrace Harold's vision of redemption or simply go through the motions. The old security guard had taken an enormous risk by not reporting the assault. Harold's reputation, his job, and potentially his freedom were now tied to Thomas's success or failure. If Thomas committed another crime or failed to complete his community service, Harold could face charges for obstruction of justice or aiding a criminal. But Harold believed the risk was worth taking. Something in Thomas's confession had convinced the old guard that he was dealing with a good man who'd lost his way, not a criminal who'd finally revealed his true nature. Harold's decades of experience reading people told him that Thomas McKinnon was worth saving. As Thomas walked home through the quiet morning streets, he carried Harold's business card in his pocket, along with the bank's foreclosure notice. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he might have a future worth fighting for. The first Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Thomas's uncertain mood as he stood outside Mrs. Chen's small house at exactly 8 o'clock. Harold was already there, wearing work clothes instead of his security uniform, studying the overgrown yard with the careful eye of someone planning a complex operation. The property looked even worse in daylight than Thomas had imagined from Harold's description. Weeds had taken over what had once been carefully maintained flower beds, growing so tall they obscured the front windows. The small lawn was patchy and brown, choked with dandelions and crabgrass. A beautiful old maple tree dominated the front yard, but its lower branches had grown wild and untrimmed, blocking the walkway and scraping against the house's aluminum siding. Mrs. Chen appeared at her door as the two men surveyed the work ahead. She was tiny and elegant, probably in her 80s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. Her English was accented but precise, and Thomas could hear both dignity and embarrassment in her voice as she thanked them for their help. Harold introduced Thomas simply as a friend who needed some outdoor work to do, protecting both Mrs. Chen's pride and Thomas's privacy. The old woman served them tea before they began, insisting that proper work required proper preparation. As they sat in her small, immaculate kitchen, Thomas noticed photographs covering every available surface. A younger Mrs. Chen with a distinguished man who must have been her husband, family gatherings and garden parties held in the very yard they were about to restore. Mrs. Chen told them about her late husband's passion for gardening, how he'd spent every morning and evening tending to his plants with the same care most people reserved for children. After his death, she'd tried to maintain his work, but arthritis and failing eyesight had made the task impossible. The city's citation notices had filled her with shame, but hiring professional landscapers was beyond her fixed income. Thomas found himself genuinely moved by Mrs. Chen's story, recognizing in her loss something that echoed his own grief. Harold had been right about the power of helping others. Focusing on Mrs. Chen's problems gave Thomas a break from the constant weight of his own troubles. For the first time in months, he felt useful rather than hopeless. The work proved more challenging than either man had anticipated. Years of neglect had allowed weeds to establish deep root systems that required careful removal to avoid damaging the valuable plants hidden beneath. Harold's knee prevented him from doing heavy physical labor, but his knowledge of plants and landscaping proved invaluable in directing their efforts. Thomas discovered that his construction experience translated well to garden restoration. The same attention to detail that served him well in building houses helped him distinguish between weeds and dormant perennials, between damaged branches that needed removal and healthy growth that should be preserved. The physical labor felt good after weeks of inactivity and self-pity. As they worked, Harold shared more stories about his police career, but these were different from the tales Thomas might have expected. Instead of dramatic arrests or dangerous situations, Harold talked about the small acts of kindness that had made the biggest difference in his cases. He described helping a homeless veteran find housing, mediating a neighborhood dispute that could have escalated to violence, and staying after his shift to help a confused elderly man find his way home. Thomas began to understand that Harold's approach to both police work and life was fundamentally different from what he'd assumed. The old guard believed that most problems stemmed from people feeling isolated and hopeless, rather than inherently evil. Crime was often a symptom of deeper issues: poverty, mental illness, addiction, or simply the loss of connection to community and purpose. By the end of their first day, they'd made impressive progress. The front flower beds were cleared and ready for replanting. The maple tree was properly pruned, and the lawn was mowed and edged. Mrs. Chen invited them in for lunch, serving homemade soup and sandwiches while expressing amazement at the transformation of her yard. But the real transformation was happening inside Thomas. The combination of physical work, Harold's quiet wisdom, and Mrs. Chen's gratitude was awakening something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death. He felt connected to something larger than his own pain, part of a community rather than isolated in his grief. The following Saturday brought new challenges as they tackled the backyard, which had become a jungle of overgrown shrubs and invasive vines. Thomas worked with increasing enthusiasm, finding satisfaction in the methodical process of restoration. Harold continued to share insights about life and human nature, treating their work sessions as informal philosophy classes. During their third weekend together, Harold revealed more about his own struggles. His police pension was smaller than expected due to budget cuts, and his wife Mary's medical expenses continued to mount. Harold had taken the security job not just for extra income, but because he needed to feel useful after decades of serving his community. Retirement had been harder than he'd anticipated, leaving him feeling disconnected from the sense of purpose that had defined his life. Thomas realized that Harold's offer of redemption served both men's needs. Harold needed someone to help with physical tasks his aging body couldn't handle, while Thomas needed a way to rebuild his sense of self-worth through meaningful work. Their partnership was creating value for both of them while serving their community. As Mrs. Chen's garden slowly returned to its former beauty, neighbors began to take notice. Several people stopped to compliment the work and ask who was responsible for the transformation. Mrs. Chen proudly introduced Harold and Thomas as her angels, praising their skill and kindness to anyone who would listen. The positive attention felt strange to Thomas, who'd grown accustomed to feeling invisible and worthless. People were treating him with respect and admiration, recognizing him as someone who made a positive difference in the world. It was a far cry from the shame and self-loathing that had driven him to consider robbery just weeks earlier. Harold watched Thomas's growing confidence with satisfaction, recognizing the signs of a man rediscovering his purpose. The old guard's gamble was paying off, but he knew the real test was still to come. Mrs. Chen's garden was just the beginning of Thomas's journey toward redemption. The Martinez family's house presented a completely different set of challenges that would test both Thomas's construction skills and his emotional resilience.
Harold had arranged the meeting carefully,
explaining to Carmen and Miguel Martinez that he knew someone with the expertise to help make their home accessible for their son Diego without charging the astronomical fees that professional contractors demanded. Diego Martinez had been 17 when the accident happened, a star athlete with college scholarship offers and dreams of becoming a physical therapist. A drunk driver had run a red light on a rainy Tuesday evening, changing everything in an instant. Now 19, Diego was paralyzed from the waist down and confined to a single room in his family's small house because the narrow doorways and multiple steps made the rest of the home inaccessible. Thomas felt his stomach tighten as Harold introduced him to the family. Diego's situation hit too close to home, reminding him of the months he'd spent watching Sarah waste away, feeling helpless as her world gradually shrank to the confines of their bedroom. The young man's forced smile and determined cheerfulness made Thomas's chest ache with recognition and admiration. Carmen Martinez worked 2 jobs as a house cleaner and night shift hospital aide, while Miguel put in long hours at a factory that manufactured auto parts. Their combined income barely covered basic expenses and Diego's ongoing medical needs, leaving nothing for home modifications. Insurance had covered the initial hospital stay and rehabilitation, but accessibility improvements were considered elective rather than necessary. The family's pride was evident in their small, meticulously maintained home where every surface gleamed despite years of wear. Photographs of Diego's athletic achievements covered the living room walls, alongside pictures of family gatherings and celebrations. The contrast between the young man's former vitality and his current limitations was heartbreaking and inspiring. Harold had done his research, consulting with disability advocates and accessibility experts to understand exactly what modifications would make the biggest difference for Diego's independence and quality of life. The list was extensive but manageable for someone with Thomas's skills. Widening doorways, installing ramps, lowering light switches and cabinet hardware, and modifying the bathroom to accommodate a wheelchair. Thomas spent their first weekend at the Martinez house taking measurements and assessing the work required. Diego insisted on being involved in every discussion, his engineering mindset evident as he asked detailed questions about construction techniques and accessibility standards. The young man's intelligence and determination reminded Thomas of Sarah's refusal to let her illness define her limitations, though the project became more complex as they discovered underlying issues that needed attention before accessibility modifications could be made. The house's electrical system was outdated and potentially dangerous, requiring careful rewiring in several rooms. The bathroom's plumbing needed updating to accommodate new fixtures, and the front entrance required structural reinforcement to support a permanent ramp. Thomas found himself working extra hours during the week, stopping by the Martinez house after his regular construction job to make incremental progress. Harold's knee prevented him from doing physical labor, but he proved invaluable as a project coordinator, ordering materials at contractor prices and ensuring all work met legal accessibility requirements. The entire Martinez family became involved in the project, with Carmen providing meals and Miguel offering assistance with tasks that didn't require specialized skills. Diego appointed himself project supervisor, using his enforced downtime to research accessibility solutions and suggest improvements to their plans. The family's gratitude was overwhelming, but their insistence on contributing however they could maintained their dignity throughout the process. As the weeks progressed, Thomas discovered that working on Diego's accessibility modifications was healing something deep inside him. Unlike his experience with Sarah's illness, where he'd felt helpless against an unstoppable disease, this project allowed him to actually solve problems and improve someone's quality of life. Every doorway he widened and every barrier he removed represented a tangible victory against circumstance and limitation. Harold watched Thomas's growing investment in the Martinez family with quiet satisfaction. The old guard had chosen this project specifically because he knew it would challenge Thomas to look beyond his own problems and connect with others facing even greater challenges. The partnership between the grieving widower and the disabled young man was proving therapeutic for both. Diego's resilience and positive attitude gradually wore down Thomas's defenses against hope and connection. The young man refused to let his paralysis define his possibilities, instead focusing on what he could accomplish rather than what he'd lost. His determination to eventually live independently and return to school inspired Thomas to reconsider his own surrender to grief and circumstance. The bathroom renovation proved the most challenging aspect of the project, requiring careful coordination between plumbing, electrical, and accessibility modifications. Thomas worked with meticulous attention to detail, knowing that mistakes could create safety hazards for someone already dealing with physical vulnerabilities. The pressure was intense, but it felt good to have his skills matter so much to someone else's well-being. Carmen Martinez began treating Thomas like family, insisting he stay for dinner after work sessions and checking on his own health and happiness with maternal concern. Miguel shared stories about his own immigration experience and the challenges of building a life in a new country, drawing parallels between his struggles and Thomas's grief journey that were both humbling and encouraging. As the accessibility modifications neared completion, Thomas realized that something fundamental had shifted in his perspective. The work was no longer just about fulfilling his obligation to Harold or avoiding criminal charges. He genuinely cared about the Martinez family's welfare and felt invested in Diego's future success. The project had become personal in the best possible way. Harold's strategy was working exactly as he'd hoped. By connecting Thomas with people who needed his help, the old guard was rebuilding Thomas's sense of purpose and self-worth through service rather than simply punishing him for his moment of desperation. The approach was risky and unconventional, but it was producing results that traditional criminal justice could never achieve. The completion of Diego's accessibility project would mark the halfway point in Thomas's 6-month commitment to Harold. But both men knew that something much more significant than a simple agreement was taking shape. Thomas was rediscovering who he could be when his skills and compassion were directed outward rather than consumed by self-pity and despair. 3 months into his arrangement with Harold, Thomas faced his greatest test when the bank's foreclosure proceedings reached their final stage. Despite his renewed sense of purpose and growing connections in the community, he still hadn't found a solution to his mounting financial problems. The weekend work with Harold was meaningful but unpaid, and his regular construction job barely covered basic living expenses. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, giving Thomas exactly 30 days to vacate the house he'd shared with Sarah for 8 years. He sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by memories and holding the legal document that would soon make him homeless. All the progress he'd made with Harold's guidance seemed insignificant compared to this crushing reality. Thomas's first instinct was to reach for the bottle of whiskey he kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator. The old familiar escape beckoned, promising temporary relief from problems that seemed too large to solve. But as his hand touched the bottle, he thought about Diego Martinez's determination to build a future despite overwhelming obstacles, and about Mrs. Chen's dignity in the face of loss and aging. Instead of drinking, Thomas called Harold. The old security guard listened without judgment as Thomas explained his situation, the shame evident in his voice as he admitted that all their work together might be meaningless if he ended up living on the streets. Harold's response surprised Thomas with its immediate practicality and warmth. Harold had been expecting this conversation for weeks, having noticed signs of financial stress in Thomas's appearance and demeanor. The old guard had spent his police career learning to read people's circumstances, and he'd developed a plan for exactly this situation. Harold's proposal was characteristic of his unconventional approach to problem solving. The Martinez family had been discussing their need for additional income to cover Diego's ongoing medical expenses and future educational costs. Their house had a basement that could be converted into a small apartment, but they lacked both the construction expertise and the financial resources to complete the project. Harold suggested that Thomas could do the conversion work in exchange for affordable rent, creating a solution that helped both parties. Carmen and Miguel Martinez embraced the idea immediately, having grown fond of Thomas during the accessibility project. They trusted his work quality and appreciated his genuine care for Diego's well-being. The basement apartment would provide them with rental income, while giving Thomas affordable housing and continued purpose through meaningful work. The conversion project became Thomas's most ambitious undertaking yet, requiring him to transform a cluttered storage space into a comfortable living area with proper insulation, electrical service, plumbing, and accessibility features. Diego insisted that the apartment be fully wheelchair accessible, joking that he wanted to be able to visit his future tenant without assistance. Thomas worked on the basement conversion with an intensity born of necessity and hope. This wasn't just about creating housing for himself. It was about proving that Harold's faith in his redemption was justified. Every wall he framed and every pipe he installed represented another step away from the desperate man who'd almost robbed a jewelry store and toward someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Harold's role evolved during this project from supervisor to consultant and friend. The old guard's knowledge of building codes and permit requirements proved invaluable, while his connections with local officials helped streamline the approval process. But more importantly, Harold's steady presence provided emotional support during moments when Thomas felt overwhelmed by the scope of the work. The basement apartment project attracted attention from other neighbors who'd heard about the accessibility modifications and Mrs. Chen's garden restoration. Word spread about Thomas's skills and reasonable prices, leading to inquiries about other home improvement projects. Harold encouraged Thomas to consider these opportunities, suggesting that helping neighbors could become a legitimate source of additional income. Mrs. Chen became Thomas's most enthusiastic advocate, telling everyone about the beautiful garden restoration and recommending his services to friends at the senior center. The elderly woman had noticed positive changes in Thomas's demeanor over the months they'd worked together, watching him transform from a broken, desperate man into someone who took pride in his work and genuine pleasure in helping others. The breakthrough came when Mr. Peterson, who lived 2 streets over, approached Thomas about repairing his elderly mother's front steps. The concrete stairs had cracked and become dangerous, creating a significant fall risk for the 85-year-old woman. Professional contractors had quoted prices that Mr. Peterson couldn't afford on his teacher's salary, but he'd heard that Thomas did quality work at fair prices. Thomas completed the step repair during evenings after his regular job, working by portable lights to make the stairs safe before winter. Weather made them even more treacherous. Mrs. Peterson was so grateful that she insisted on paying more than the agreed-upon price and recommended Thomas to 3 other neighbors who needed similar work. As autumn progressed toward winter, Thomas found himself busier than he'd been since before Sarah's illness. His weekends were still committed to Harold's community service projects, but his evenings and occasional vacation days were filled with paid work that helped him rebuild his financial stability. The combination of regular construction employment and neighborhood handyman jobs was slowly pulling him out of the financial hole that had nearly destroyed his life. Harold watched Thomas's growing success with mixed emotions. Pride dominated his feelings as he saw the transformation his unconventional intervention had produced, but he also felt some anxiety about what would happen when their 6-month agreement ended. The old guard had grown genuinely fond of Thomas and valued their partnership in helping neighbors who needed assistance. The basement apartment neared completion as Thomas entered his 5th month of weekend service. The space had been transformed into a comfortable studio with a small kitchen, full bathroom, and separate entrance that provided privacy for both Thomas and the Martinez family. Diego had contributed design suggestions that made the apartment more functional and accessible than originally planned. Moving day arrived on a cold November morning, with several neighbors volunteering to help Thomas relocate his belongings from the house he was losing to foreclosure. The contrast between this move and what it could have been struck Thomas forcefully. Instead of becoming homeless and desperate, he was moving into a home he'd built with his own hands, surrounded by friends who respected his skills and valued his contributions to their community. Carmen Martinez prepared a feast to celebrate Thomas's move-in day, inviting Harold, Mrs. Chen, and several other neighbors who'd become part of their extended community. The gathering felt like a homecoming rather than a defeat, marking Thomas's successful transition from isolated grief to connected purpose. Harold made a brief speech during the dinner, acknowledging Thomas's hard work and character, while carefully avoiding any mention of the circumstances that had brought them together. To the gathered neighbors, Harold and Thomas were simply friends who'd found meaningful work helping others in their community. The old guard's discretion protected Thomas's privacy, while allowing him to enjoy the respect he'd earned through months of dedicated service. As Thomas settled into his new home that evening, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that desperate night outside the jewelry store. The man who'd been ready to throw away everything good about himself had somehow found a path back to dignity and purpose. Harold's gamble on redemption through service had succeeded beyond either man's expectations. But Thomas knew that his real test was still approaching. In 1 month, his obligation to Harold would officially end, and he would face the choice of whether to continue their partnership or pursue other directions. The old guard had given him back his life, but now Thomas needed to decide what to do with the gift he'd been given. The 6th month of Thomas's agreement with Harold arrived with the first snow of winter, blanketing the neighborhood in pristine white that seemed to symbolize the fresh start both men had created together. Thomas woke in his basement apartment feeling something he hadn't experienced in over a year, genuine excitement about the day ahead. Their final official project involved helping the Kowalski family prepare their elderly father's house for his return from rehabilitation after a stroke. Stanley Kowalski had been a fixture in the neighborhood for 40 years, a retired mechanic who'd helped countless neighbors with car repairs and practical advice. His recent stroke had left him with limited mobility on his left side, requiring modifications to his house similar to what they'd done for Diego Martinez. But Stanley's situation was complicated by his fierce independence and refusal to accept what he saw as charity. Harold's approach to Stanley's stubborn pride demonstrated the wisdom he'd gained through decades of dealing with difficult personalities. Instead of presenting the modifications as charity, Harold framed them as a business arrangement where Stanley would pay for materials, while Thomas provided labor at a significant discount. The old mechanic's dignity remained intact while ensuring he received the help he needed to live safely in his own home. Thomas threw himself into Stanley's project with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered his true calling. The work required creativity and precision, adapting accessibility solutions to an older home with quirky layouts and outdated systems. Stanley's mechanical knowledge proved valuable as he suggested innovative solutions that Thomas could implement with his construction skills working. With Stanley also provided Thomas with a different perspective on aging and independence. Unlike Mrs. Chen's gracious acceptance of help or Diego's youthful optimism, Stanley's gruff determination to maintain his autonomy challenged Thomas to find solutions that preserved the old man's sense of control over his environment. The project became a delicate balance between safety improvements and respect for Stanley's established routines. As they worked together, Stanley shared stories about the neighborhood's history and the changes he'd witnessed over 4 decades. Thomas learned about families who'd struggled and succeeded, about neighbors who'd helped each other through crises, and about the informal networks of support that made their community more than just a collection of houses. Stanley's tales reinforced the lesson Harold had been teaching about the power of connection and mutual aid. The completion of Stanley's modifications coincided with the end of Thomas's 6-month commitment to Harold, but neither man felt ready to conclude their partnership. Over coffee at their familiar all-night diner, Harold made a proposal that would formalize what had become an informal community service organization. He suggested they create a nonprofit that could accept donations and grants to help neighbors who needed home repairs and modifications but couldn't afford professional contractors. Thomas was initially overwhelmed by the scope of Harold's vision, but the old guard had spent months preparing for this conversation. Harold had researched the legal requirements for nonprofit status, identified potential funding sources, and developed relationships with local officials who supported their approach to community development. What had started as an improvised solution to Thomas's crisis had evolved into a sustainable model for helping others. The decision to move forward with the nonprofit required Thomas to confront his fears about taking on such responsibility. He worried about his lack of business experience, his criminal past, and his worthiness to lead an organization dedicated to helping others. Harold listened patiently to these concerns before offering perspective that only someone who'd seen Thomas's transformation could provide. Harold reminded Thomas that leadership wasn't about perfection or credentials. It was about commitment to serving others and the wisdom that came from overcoming personal challenges. Thomas's experience with grief, desperation, and redemption gave him unique insight into the struggles their neighbors faced. His construction skills provided practical value, but his empathy and determination to help others were what made him truly qualified for this work. The conversation continued through the night as they developed plans for their organization. They would call it Second Chance Construction, acknowledging both the redemptive opportunities they provided to clients and the second chance Thomas had received through Harold's intervention. The name carried personal significance while clearly communicating their mission to potential supporters and beneficiaries. Harold revealed that he'd been documenting their projects throughout the 6 months, photographing completed work and collecting testimonials from grateful neighbors. This portfolio would support their grant applications and demonstrate the impact they could achieve with proper funding. The old guard's police training in evidence collection and report writing had prepared him well for nonprofit administration. As dawn broke over the city, Thomas and Harold finalized their commitment to continue working together beyond the original agreement. What had begun as punishment for a moment of desperate poor judgment had become a genuine partnership dedicated to strengthening their community. Thomas's obligation to Harold was ending, but their friendship and shared mission were just beginning. The transformation was complete when Thomas stood before the mirror in his basement apartment, preparing for their first official meeting with a potential foundation supporter. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the broken drunk who'd raised a bottle against an innocent security guard 6 months earlier. This Thomas stood straight, his eyes clear and focused, his purpose evident in every gesture. Harold's gamble on redemption through service had succeeded beyond either man's wildest expectations. Thomas had not only avoided becoming a criminal, he'd become a community leader whose work improved countless lives. The old security guard's unconventional approach to justice had created something beautiful and lasting from what could have been a tragedy. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story was how it had transformed Harold as well. The old guard had rediscovered his sense of purpose and meaning, finding a way to continue serving his community long after his official retirement from law enforcement. In saving Thomas, Harold had also saved himself from the isolation and irrelevance that had threatened to define his golden years. Their story became local legend. Though few people knew the true circumstances of how their partnership began, neighbors spoke admiringly of the two men who selflessly helped others, never suspecting that their collaboration had roots in a moment of violence and desperation. The secret they shared had become the foundation for something beautiful, proving that redemption was possible for anyone willing to earn it through service to others.